Now we are ready to understand how does these panel functions work. We're going to first start by creating our own panel function. Okay, so let's come here and say my panel. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a function, right? So in this function, I'm first going to specify the arguments x and y, right? And I'm going to say we can also have additional arguments, right? So these x and y, they correspond to the x and y data to plot for each panel. And I'm going to first say, in this function, I simply just want to demonstrate. So I'm going to say, come in here and say print panel function is executing. Okay, then I'm going to say go into a new line, right? So basically what I've just done here is I created this simple function that will print panel function executing. Okay, so let me run this, control enter. Now let's say we want to create a scatter plot. So let's come now here on the console, right, and say I want to create a scatter plot, right? So in this scatter plot, I want smiles per gallon. We're gonna use this data set, empty cars, and now weight. Okay, now let's say we also want to group by cylinder, right? So we first have to convert it into a vector, and then we come in here and say empty cars data set. Now additionally, we want to specify this argument panel, right? And we're gonna pass in my panel function. Okay, we're gonna pass in my panel function. So if we run this, what you are seeing here, there is nothing that has been plotted, but we are seeing that panel function executing, panel function executing, panel function executing. That is because we have replaced the default panel function with our own function. This one, my panel. Okay, so what we did, we replaced the default panel function with our own function. But our own panel function doesn't do anything except printing this short message that say panel function executing, panel function executing, and panel function executing. It does not do nothing else. Okay, so what you should also note is that this function, when we define this function, right, so you come in here, it doesn't do anything to x and y, right? So that is why we have no graphical elements. Okay, so do not forget that when you create your own panel function, you have to specify what that panel function will do. Okay, now let us come here and change this function. Say now, instead of just printing panel function executing, what we want to do is we want this function to perform some graphical routines. Okay, so in order to do that, we can simply just use the default one and say panel dot xy plot. Okay, so in that case, we will simply just define this function, my panel function. What we will do is that we will pass in this function, which is a default one, right? So what we do is we are calling this panel function within my panel function, right? So let's run this and see. Control enter. So let's come here in the console. Now let's see what will this do. So if you run this, we're getting an error. So we made a mistake. So let's come back here. Should be 3 dots. So let's run this again. Now we are ready to call this function. So now you are seeing that now what does this function do? it is creating a scatter plot, right? But now what it's doing is that this time the xy plot is using our own mypanel function to create this scatter plot. So it will pass the input on to this function, onto this default one, and it will go ahead and it will create a scatter plot. So this here is an example of how does these functions work. We also have tons of these panel functions. So let's see here using a regular expression, right? So we're going to use this function, right, and try and see all these panel functions that we have. Okay, so we're going to come here and say panel. So if you run this, so this here is an example of all the panel functions. So as you observe here, we have panel.xy, the one that we've been using. There's tons of them. Also, we have points. We also have grade.plot, density plot. So these are all the panel functions that we have in R.